So thank you very much for the invitation, and for Tony, for Tony and to Mark to basically bring me here. I am very happy to be able to share my work with you. So this is, first of all, I want to start with this picture. This picture is from the rebellion of 2019 that happened in Chile, the uprising that gave way to a constituent process. So the Constituent Assembly was called after this. This was basically the repression against the movement. So how I understand the kind of a new system of democracy in which the people are really powerful is kind of like this, in the sense that we need shields to defend ourselves and to resist the oligarchic pressure that comes from not only the kind of private sector corporations, but also the state. Okay. So I want to start with some with some concepts. The first concept that I want to analyze is democracy, because when we talk about moving away from a system in which only the few have power and the many just authorize those in power, which is not really power, there's always that kind of a going back to what democracy is really about. And we use this word very loosely. We mean different things. It's what Ernesto Laclau would call an empty signifier. Many people project their principles and values into this concept, democracy, and the majority of us have been kind of acculturated or educated into representative democracy exclusively. So we only vote for others to rule. We don't vote on issues. The majority of people around the world only elect. That's it. So in ancient Athens, where democracy comes from, democracy, demos and kratos, this kind of conjuncture of two different concepts, means actually people's power. And we're not talking about here the people as the nation or the people as a whole, but the people as the common people. As in the Roman Republic, the plebeians, the plebs, right? The working classes, however you're the 99%, however you want to characterize it. So it's a specific power of the people below. And this translated into basically equal vote on law and policy in an assembly, in making decisions by majority, and participating actively in the government. Of course, not everybody could participate, but it was open to all male citizens. And of course, these are all kind of trouble in the ancient world. And there were two principles of democracy. One was isonomia, so isonomy, the idea of not kind of equal equality under the law as we understand it, but actually as the equal right to create the law, right, and judge the law. And isegoria, which is we understand now as free speech, is basically the opportunity to present a law and to get that law passed, or to speak against a law or policy in the assembly. So there were basically kind of a legal initiative from below. And today, we have translated this idea of democracy into the rule by the people's representative, which basically is not the same as the people's power, right? And then this equality to propose law or to select, to be selected and to basically engage in self-government has been understood as elections, just like that in a way. This idea that we are equal because we can vote, we have suffrage to vote for others. That is the basis of our equality in democracy. And finally is this idea of free speech. So instead of being able to propose law or veto law, and speak against a law or policy being created, you have this idea of freedom of speech as free expression, individual expression as a very kind of radical understanding in the United States, which is a very individualized understanding of free speech, or we understand free speech as the kind of freedom of the press, right? But not really our right to speak against the law or in favor of a law. So as I said here, basically we have these conceptual confusions in which representative government equals to democracy, and government by proxy is self-government, or kind of is understood as self-government, that people legislate, right, by electing others to do so. We confuse state sovereignty with popular sovereignty, right? We're talking about the public. We confuse it with the state all the time. And then elections with actually having political power, right? And individual expression with political speech. And these are the confusions that were constantly in our mind when we talk about democracy. And today, this system of democracy has basically created a world in which all of the nations in the world are oligarchic, in the sense that the few have more power than the many, and they control the majority of the wealth. And we have, in a way, wealthy democracies in the global north with patches and neighborhoods and regions within those countries that are poor, right? And they're the periphery within the system. And also oligarchic democracies in the global south. Of course, the global south, we understand it as like the third world countries that are less wealthy, right? But there are very wealthy people in the global south. And again, they're, capitals, the capital cities, they have this kind of pocket of wealth within mass poverty in a way and precarity. And the diagnosis here is that basically we have a level of global inequality that is very similar to the levels of inequality that were previous to the French Revolution in many places, even worse, because we don't know even how much money there is stashed away in tax havens, for example. There's just a guesstimation of how much wealth the wealthy have. So this is a very conservative take on global inequality, in which basically the richest 10% owns almost 80% of the wealth. Okay, and many countries it's even worse. And today in the United States, actually, the 1% owns more than 95% of the wealth, because of course the level of the wealthy have been, the degree of wealth have been tripling since COVID. And of course, this not only means that the few amass this amount of property, but that the many have nothing. So the many have either 1% of the wealth, which means that they have, maybe their houses and small plots, right, land. In many places, like in Latin America, they are not even have any wealth, in the sense that they are in debt. Many people live based on their debt. So therefore, if they don't own really wealth, they owe wealth back to banks, and they don't even share in this percentage. And this inequality is not only about wealth, but also, as we know, on environmental. It's about the amount of carbon that is emitted by this 10%, by the wealthiest in the world. So the top 10% emits almost 50% of all carbon around the world, right? And we know that this is concentrated in the global north. So these inequalities are in many layers. So the Transparency International report that basically measures corruption and the way that money goes to fund welfare programs and how it is basically distributed has stated that the majority of representative governments, and I'm here talking only about democracies. Of course, there's that kind of in political science, they have been trying to understand democracy in many ways, the hybrid democracy, weak democracy, strong democracies. But if they have elections, they are free and fair elections, they are considered as democracies. So within the democracies, not the authoritarian states like North Korea, they are basically endemically corrupt. It's like their corruption is really endemic to every state. And this kind of systemic run corruption not only is about quid pro quo, the officials getting money and kind of favoring the wealthy, but actually this is directly connected to the violation of human rights. Not only about human rights understood as bodily integrity, torture, imprisonment, but actually rights like the right to health or the right to education. These are constantly being violated due to this type of corruption. So part of my work has been trying to theorize this kind of insight that has gone basically unnoticed everywhere, right? So I have tried to understand that this as systemic corruption, as a corruption that comes from within and is tied to inequality. So there's three types of corruption that the theorists agree, that exist. The first one, and this is the most common one that we understand, is the individual types of corruption, that we have illegal actions of, someone paying some bribe or, appointing, someone of the family, right? All these things that we know that are petty, kind of petty corruption at this point. And this I understood as a bad apples approach. If we plug out these bad apples from the system, we will be fine, right? And this is the idea that we kind of put corruption in prison. We put people in prison because they're corrupt, but we understand that the system is still working and it's a democracy and it's okay. Of course, this is not the case. So the next level is institutional corruption that is understood as parts of the system that do not work. If we think about, again, the system of health, in many countries, especially when I'm going to give the extreme example of the United States, where all the health is based on insurance that you need to purchase, right? There's no public health in a way, or system of public health. We can understand that system of healthcare is not aimed at providing good healthcare and kind of allowing for people to be healthier, but actually is there to increase the profits of the insurance companies. And this is what has been happening for many decades. So in a way, that kind of institutional breakdown, if you will, of the healthcare system can be understood as a form of institutional corruption, which the aim of that system is not really fulfilled, but it's actually another aim, which is making, profits for the insurance companies instead of making people healthy, and therefore it doesn't work. And the next level, that is the one that I bring, is the idea of systemic corruption, in which we have rules of the games. How the system works is not that there's something bad with it or there's something not working, but actually the system has been designed in a manner in which the rule of law is constantly benefiting those who already have power and money in a way. So the more poor you are, if you go to a bank, right, and you go and ask for a loan, if you have no money, then the interest rates they're going to be applied to you for that loan are very, very high. However, if you have money and you have collateral, all these things, your interest rates are very, very low. So for you as an individual, the more precarious you are, the more expensive it is to get into debt to do something, right? So this is how the system in general works. So the rule of the law disproportionately benefits those on the top, and it promotes inequality. And we see that the inequality has been rising for decades now. Right, the gap between wages and capital, between what people are paid at the rank and file level and the CEOs have been exponentially growing without any kind of limit, and this is allowed and perfectly legal, right? So systemic corruption, I have defined this as a kind of a slow-moving process of oligarchization of society. So even if you start from a place in which we are relatively equal, the rules of the game would allow for the actions of individuals to end up in more inequality than before. So in a way, it promotes inequality because it doesn't restrain it, okay? So we understand that the law is not necessarily a form of justice in a way, or it's not just the law, and that it's also not promoting freedom of people. Some laws actually promote the freedom of the few to oppress the many, but not really protect the many in any manner. And corruption is not necessarily illegal, right? We have been legalizing forms of corruption, starting with campaign finance and lobbyists, right? Lobbyism was illegal before the 80s, and campaign finance was illegal before the early 20th century. Something that was considered, of course, corrupt if you just go and give a check to your candidate. There's not such thing as a free lunch, say, in the US. This is how it is understood, right? That when you give money to a politician, there is something that is expected in return, and therefore it was illegal before. Then it was so pervasive that they legalized it. The same happened with the lobbyist industry. So when you had a lot of people being brokers between corporations and the representatives, so you have like an access to the people that actually make the regulation, those were also illegal. You're not supposed to have that kind of special access, right? You're paying someone to go as a broker. And it was so pervasive again in the 80s that in the 90s, it became basically legal, first in the United States, but then elsewhere. And now we have lists of lobbyists that are registered to do this kind of brokering. And that doesn't make it really not corrupt. We have just legalized it, right? So here we have the understanding that if we have more inequality in a society, there is more of this systemic corruption happening, and there's more violation of human rights. And this is something that this link has not been really analyzed very much, and it needs more attention. Moreover, now we have with the genocide in Palestine and the wars everywhere that the United States is trying to start. We know that not only inequality is fueling this oligarchization, but also war. War has been historically kind of the mode of accumulation of oligarchy. So it was either war or a tribute, right? Before, lords have people living in their land and they would get some tributes. And the moment that they will get more wealthier is to go into war, having loot, right? Colonizing other places. So the more war we have, the more that now it is into kind of the debt of the state to go into war, right? To pay for those weapons. And that kind of extra cash flow allows for a lot of luxury. It is kind of connected, this idea. So we now have a society in which we have an oligarchic ethos that is very pervasive, that we really want the Lamborghini or the very high-tech, consumer products, and everybody wants to have them in a way. And that is kind of a lust for consumer goods that we don't really need, but gives us status. So if we think about the republics in the ancient world, in which they were more democratic and more closer to the popular rule, it was not luxury. Luxury actually was demonized completely. Like, this is not a good thing ever, especially religious trends against luxury and against usury and against kind of this the banking elite that were pervasive. They had as a principle frugality. You need to live within your means. You need to be able to live in an ecosystem. We're bringing it to today, right? That is sustainable. If you just want all the consumer goods, and if we think about extending the way that people live today in the global north to the whole world, we will need at least 6 more planets to do that. We cannot really consume at the level of the wealthiest in the wealthiest parts of the world. So the next that I want to tackle before going into what I think it is the more auspicious part of the talk is oligarchy. So here I want to tell you a little bit, and maybe you're familiar with this, but there, of course, the ancient theorists in which, on whom we base our understanding of democracy and politics, they understood that all of the regime types, they degrade, they corrupt. We have Plato saying basically that you have like this philosopher king's regime, and then it is the soldiers that take over, and then it's oligarchy, and then democracy, and then it's like mob rule and completely anarchy, right? And there's like a path of degradation, but then you go back again to the kings and you start all over again. The same as Aristotle also, but for him, different from Plato, who was a kind of a purist in a way, that you have a pure regime that degrades into a very bad one. For Aristotle, mutation based on mixture was the best form of government for him. And every regime type is a mixture. So he talked about the principle of diversifying antithesis, that basically you have elements within a regime, and the combination and the different strength of those elements within the regime will give kind of the nature or character of that regime type. So on this, and his idea of democracy as being the combination of the two worst forms of government, oligarchy and democracy. We have the politeia, which is basically the model for our democracy in a way, or for the ideal type, right? That there is a democracy that will, or a regime that will not easily corrupt, because you have two competing interests, and the kind of combination and struggle between those principles would allow for that kind of regime to be sustainable. So if we think about the politeia as a mixed regime and very close to what we have today in this imaginary, we have that this regime type was based on first inequality of wealth. So it was not like a communist regime, right, in which you cannot have the private means of production. You actually have very wealthy elites, but you had people sharing government. So everyone, regardless of their wealth, they could participate in the assembly. And for you to understand how the mechanics of it worked, the ecclesia, the sovereign assembly met in kind of a hill, and they had like a perimeter, and all the people that would fit in that perimeter for the day were the people making the decisions. Okay, so basically we're like around 3,000 people that met in a space, basically, and they would be from the morning until the evening making decisions. That population would fluctuate, right? It would be different every time, but basically everybody had the equal share. This didn't mean that the working classes were actually participating, because when you are part of the producing classes, you need to be able to work, right, for a living. If you just leave your field to, not tending to it, you are not going to eat. So therefore, you needed to choose between, going into the field or going into politics. So the majority of people participating were part of the elite. And for him, the crucial thing is that for this to be stable, the majority of people needed to be property owners, part of kind of the middle class. They needed to be able to have some kind of stability economically in order to be able to be free to participate in politics and to not ask for redistribution, because this was part of class war for him. So that needed to be neutralized. So here we entered the idea of liberal representative democracy, which is kind of the hybrid regime type that we have. And we have a combination of people that are elected, so therefore a kind of a political class, the few, even if they're not the few when they start, they become the few by payment, by separation, by power, right? And then the majority interest that is expressed through the ballot box, right? And this is kind of framed by constitutions that have separation of powers and have individual rights. This is kind of the basic structure. So this regime type, according to Aristotle's theory, would degrade or corrupt either towards the majority will and becoming kind of what we could call a left populist democracy, or it would degrade towards the power of the few. And therefore, we would have an oligarchic democracy, a democracy that basically it is only formal in terms of the role of the people, and would express the oligarchic ethos and power. So oligarchic democracy is, and then we can define it as a regime in which the elected few are there in power through the popular vote, and that is what it makes it democratic, in a way that we go and vote for them, but still they don't legislate for the majority will or for the majority welfare. In a way, the majority does not increase its wealth, does not increase their material conditions, in a way, their welfare, but actually legislate and make policy that allows for the further enrichment or empowerment of the few, right? Or they cease to legislate. They don't do what they should be doing. So if we think about today a wealth tax, that should be like a sensible policy in order to put a cap on this kind of like super extreme inequality. They're just not doing it. Talking about climate change, they have done nothing in a way to stop it. So in a way, the inaction or the negligence of politicians is also a way of increasing this oligarchization of democracy. So all of the states are in a way extractivists today, and oligarchic on the one hand, that are ruled by the few, and basically the machinery of law is used for the enrichment of the few, and it is exploitative of the many. So, and nature as well. So especially in Latin America, where the resources and the rest of the world are, right, in the global north and the global south. So on the one hand, we have taxation schemes that are really regressive. So the VAT, for example, right, that you pay, the payment that you do to the government or to the state when you buy things is very regressive, because, you know, if you have little money, you spend it all in this kind of market, and therefore you pay a lot of taxes. And this makes the state kind of rentiers, this kind of extracting from the people. More extreme examples are, for example, the communities in which policing ends up enriching the state. So, for example, it's giving tickets to drivers, to vehicles. They have a quota policeman, and they would kind of, the state would receive a partial part of the fine. So you would even fund the government directly by extracting and targeting communities and extracting from taxes. The same happened with nature. Many of the states engage in this hybrid private-public enterprises to go and extract resources from the earth, polluting everything, right, hurting communities, but they receive a cut. And it doesn't really translate into welfare for all, especially in the global south, in which the natural resources are extracted and then brought to the global north, right? And these transnational corporations are the ones that are getting the biggest cut. So here is a picture of from the New Yorker of this is way before Trump was elected, or just at the beginning of the presidency, where Donald Trump is basically shielded by the Supreme Court. We understand that regular democracy, well functioning, you have separation of powers, and the courts are there to protect individuals against state arbitrary power and to keep the executive and legislative accountable, in the sense that they would say if a law shouldn't be on the books, if a law is a form of domination, they would, strike it down, or if the president is exceeding its power, they would basically control. However, now we have the three branches of power of government, at least in the United States, but in many places in the world, are basically colluded, and they are not. The checks and balances are not working. So one of the theories that I use is the Marquis of Condorcet, who was the president of the Constitutional Committee during the French Revolution. And he was looking at the United States Constitution as the first modern democracy of the world, looking at it and say, this is not going to work. Like, this separation of power is not really checks and balances. If you have elites in the three branches, what are the odds that they're going to get together in a way? And they're all kind of the same class. So in a way, it is very easy for them to collude, and the people themselves have no recourse. So because if they're colluded, you can go to the courts and try to fight it there, but they will not help you in a way. So this is what he calls indirect despotism. When this kind of, I would have a procedurally sound, like nothing is being, nothing illegal is going on, but in this spaces of power, but representation, the idea of being represented in the state and also protected by the law, is not neither equal nor real, and you have a de facto oligarchy that it operates within the bounds of the law. It stretches the law without breaking it in a way. So we cannot call it by the name, right? It's always indirect. So oligarchic power, which basically emanates from these spaces that we have institutionalized in democracy, is not only about ruling, it's not only about managing resources, it's about also controlling the capacity to imagine a new world, to determine what is realistic in a given moment. So basically the oligarchic power operates through at least three different systems. One is the political or formal, in which you have, rules being made, and therefore that is a well of world making. You create a limit of how should be or could be things. An economic one, the de facto control over things, right? And if you want to have like an enterprise that is cooperative with grassroots, it's very difficult to do that and compete. So they have a control over it. And then the symbolic one, which is spread through the media and through this idea of the oligarchic ethos, that everybody wants to be rich. Everybody wants to be a YouTuber and earn, money without doing anything. This is, at least my 14-year-old says that all the time, which is disheartening. But there is this idea that I want to be rich and be a millionaire and be doing it easy, and be like the oligarchs. We have, I'm connected to this. So Donald Trump has been, as you know, pushing for tariffs as a kind of a economic war against other countries, right? And it has been very unpopular because prices are going up. So what he has been doing now is trying to give U.S. citizens a dividend of the tariffs. So he's saying that individuals are going to profit from this kind of policy, which is a kind of economic bullying, if you will, against other countries. And therefore, the people will become, because they benefit from it, they will agree with it, and they will be, in this way, pro-oligarchic, is the oligarchy wins when the common people want to be and operates like the oligarchy, right? So this is part of kind of the symbolic power through education, the media, advertisement. So how do we exit oligarchic democracy toward a more plebeian democracy, in a way, a system in which the people really have power, right? Making true, for me, the plebeian democracy is making true the promise of democracy as the people's power, as in ancient Greece. So part of what I've been trying to understand is from where do we need to theorize? How do we look at the problem? And for me, I follow Machiavelli, the famous theorist from Renaissance Florence. He was part of, he was part of the elite, but his father was in debt, so he could not really hold office. He was kind of he had a deteriorated status in a way in Florence, and he became part of the bureaucracy. He could not be a politician, so he became part of the bureaucracy. And he was a diplomat, and he thought, and he sold his expertise as being part of the plebs, as being part of the commons. He says the only way that one can really look at power and analyze it is to be able to look from another perspective. So he sold his expertise to the rulers and saying, please hire me, saying, I can actually give you insight because I am from the plains, and the only way to appreciate the mountains and look at the mountains and basically have a productive insight is to be from the plains, is to look from that perspective. So for me, the vantage point to look at where we're at now and having some kind of productive insight is to actually theorizing from the plains, right? From the commons, from the flat areas. And in the analysis, I bring history and theory together. So not any history, but the history of the common people, right? So another kind of the alternative kind of history, not the history that is taught in school, which tends to be very imperialistic and oligarchic, right? Of the great white men. So going into what is not really recorded because nobody cares about, which is the history of the common people. Those are where the insights, that's where the insights are. And on theory is understanding also that the majority of the theories that we use in our democratic, theory and in political science are all oligarchic thinkers, starting with Plato. Plato was an oligarch, and he actually approved and supported a coup against the democratic regime. So when we think about, there are a lot of books saying, oh, what Plato needs to teach us for democracy today, I think it's just we cannot really separate the thinker from where the thinker comes from and what they want in a way, because that is just an abstraction and that doesn't serve us. So I look at the plebeian thinkers that have been raised, have been put in the index of prohibited books. They have been shunned because those thinkers are the ones that are dangerous for the current oligarchic era. And part of this kind of a new kind of theorizing has to have a goal, which for me is people's empowerment. We cannot just have like a neutral political theory or political science. We need to really think about what is wrong with the world and try to make it better in a way, and try to think alternatives for that. And for that, we cannot just come with a blueprint, like I am going to go and read a couple of books and sit on my chair and then write a book and say, oh, this is the way to go. Because that is very elitist. That is not really understanding how things work. We need to find the insights in the plains, right? In what people actually do. Because when we think about alternative forms of society, and we crave these alternative societies, we don't understand that they're already happening everywhere in the world, especially in the global south. They are experiments that are decades. For example, in the Zapatistas in Mexico from the 1990s, that they have like a communal way of organizing. They have self-government, they have gender equality, all these things that we want, that have been proven in a way, and they have existed against all odds, against the violence of the state, against the violence of the drug cartels. So there's a lot for us to learn from those experiences that are ongoing. Cooperatives in Brazil that have created new forests or regenerated the forest in the Amazon, for example, just single-handedly. So without no resources. So we need to go and learn from that. And from that experience, we need to start theorizing. So we can have ideas based on these radical thinkers, then basically try to engage with communities and then try to learn from the community and not try to teach the community. There's not much to teach in a way. We need to kind of have a knowledge exchange, if you will, more. And this is what the critical theorists have called praxis, where theory really emerges from the action, from the political action of the many, and it is kind of turned into theoretical principles and is taught again back to the communities in a manner that is a participatory way of education. And here I use Paulo Freire, the Brazilian thinker with the pedagogy of the oppressed, and Carlos Mariátegui, who is another Latin American, who understood that in this pedagogy and in this search, it cannot be only about rationality. It cannot be only about numbers and about things that we need to learn. We really need something more. And for him, that was the myth, the narrative, the symbolic element, and the emotions that come from, the creation of a new alternative system, right? So this is part of what I try to do in my work. So finally, plebeian democracy. For me, I've always struggled with forms of organization, from anarchism and other forms of radical democracy. The theorists are always against institutions because institutions are inherently, for them, conservative. Any rules are not, no, we don't want rules. We just want permanent revolution, right? And for me, as a single mom of two little creatures, I don't have the time for permanent revolution. I need to be able to go to a place, have my grievances, have my talk, have my community, and then go back home and take care of my people, right? So we cannot have a permanent revolution in which only the people that have time and money and leisure time, basically, to engage in politics, and again, go back to this kind of elitist idea of political participation. We need to be able to organize in a different way. So I have tried to understand, government and democracy as a very animal-like form of organization, in which the government is the brain, and all of the parts of the state move as limbs, basically, and we really don't have agency. I think if the people need to organize in a horizontal manner, because we don't have really hierarchies. We need to be able to be more plant-like when organizing or thinking about what are the organizations of this plebeian democracy. So we need to pass from an oligarchic system in which the people themselves do not have a place. We don't have a place to meet. There's no town halls that operate or citizen assemblies that are permanent, right? We don't have a space. We're just voting individually. So in oligarchic democracy, there's no place for the people. And we need to move from that to a place, to a regime in which the people have places, and these spaces are not only representative, and again, kind of like mimicking what representative government is, making it more representative, but actually creating a radical network of counter-hegemonic spaces. So spaces in which these alternative modes of being are being prefigured, are being acted upon, and then they can connect and in a way also allow for the heterogeneity that people have. We're not equal. We're not a whole people. People organize in different levels. In Latin America, we have hundreds of different peoples, nations within a single nation state. So therefore, this network is necessary. If not, you will just erase or flatten the people. We need to have different kinds of knowledges coming from different parts of the world or different parts of the regions and connect in a network. So I use here Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of rhizomatic politics as something that is productive, at least for my thinking. So the rhizoma, I don't know if you, I'm part farmer, so that's why I use all these metaphors from a farmer family. So the rhizoma is basically the type of plants that are the rootstocks, basically, that there are nodes of generation of the plants. So basically, the stems and roots come from a node, and they're all connected. So you don't know that basically it is a grid. So grass, for example, is a form of a rootstock. And you see here in the image in which you don't know where is the center? There's no center, or there's no start and no end in a way. It's just a network. So a network that is not, again, not just lines, not just kind of like web, but actually have nodes that are connecting. So I think we need to think about a way of organizing this plebeian democracy as a non-linear network of these roots that grow in every direction. And therefore, the knowledge comes from everywhere and is passed through a grid, and there's no hierarchy. So if we think about this tree-like organization, we have been organizing from the ground up as a tree, kind of. We have social movements, community organizations on the base, and that, when it comes in, has kind of an ideology or a policy or something that kind of emerges from this movement. And when that is successful, it becomes a party, right? And the party just kind of interfaces with the system. And the social movements and community organizations are really powerless in the sense that they remain on the roots, and there's no really a connection with the party. And even if it was, like in the Labour Party, we know that today the connection with Labour is very tenuous, to say the least. So in a way, that connection, that kind of separation between the rank and file or the roots and the party increases with time. So at the end, it's kind of a way of acclamation of the party every time we go to the ballot box instead of actual real power. So I think we need to move from that to the idea of the mycelium. So I don't know if you know, but in the plant world, the species connect and actually talk to each other through the mycelium network, which is a network of fungi that is just below the surface. So for example, in forests, when there is either a fire or lack of water or a pest, trees emit chemical elements. In a way, they put it into the mycelium, and the mycelium basically goes into the next tree, and that tree understands what is happening, so other trees can create a kind of antibodies against that pest or move the roots very slowly to other places where there's water. There's communication among plants and different species of plants through the mycelium. So in a way, the people and their network, that is the community organizing and the kind of political spaces at the local level, they need to be kind of this kind of network, a grid of information, especially, for example, with climate change. You can have a community in which there's pollution starting. You can immediately react to that and basically raise the alarm. Now you need to go, to the municipal government, put a petition, start an investigation. It could be 2 years before you get anything from the state, and the majority of time it's just, this is how it is. There's no way to fight it. So we need to have a grid that is responsive to more drastic change and fast change everywhere. So we need to pass from elections, and the idea is we're going to think about an organization that is a plebeian organization, a popular organization. We immediately think about elections. Oh, let's elect our leaders. It immediately creates a separation between the majority and the leaders who become to kind of monopolize knowledge, know-how, connections, networks, and become indispensable. And that is demobilizing for the community. So going back to the ancient democracy, we need to switch from elections to sortition and rotation. I'm not telling here, my proposal is not to kind of change parliament into a rotation-based system. This is other people say that. I think that is impossible. People are, if they receive their salaries, they're not going to go home. It's that they have invested interest in the current institutions. I think we need to think about another alternative form of organization parallel to government that has these characteristics, okay? So the idea is that if you have leadership, you're not going to have leaders, you're going to have working groups, collective office, like in ancient Greece, because if you don't have any expertise, you cannot just do it yourself. It's very difficult. You need to come into a working group that is already operating. You can learn from them, and then you can teach others about it. So you have kind of a collective leadership, and you have rotation in this kind of offices. So people get a hang of it in a way. They know how it is to keep the rules, to do things for the community. If we're thinking about, for example, deliberation, if you're constantly on the side of the speaker, and there are rules of a 2-minute speaking time, you're always frustrated because they're cutting you off. But when you have to be the moderator, you know how difficult it is to keep people in check, and you understand that people just talking over the limit is just, you're taking out other people's time. So that's not cool. No, it's not solidarity. So when you are in the position of, again, back up to the ancient democracy, to rule and being ruled in turns, this is what Aristotle told us democracy is. So if you are in a position of power, quote unquote, then you know how it is. And then you go back to your position as, the assembly. So this is something that, knowledge goes around and circulates. We need to move from a party to a network, and from the idea of organization, which is more, there's a structure of how to do it, and there's a kind of a cookie cutter approach, like this is the way to organize, into something that is more coordination of already existing organizations, and that they have their own kind of self-governing structures that we need to respect. There's no just one way of doing politics from the ground up. So in a way, we need to have what is called the articulation, and this is from Latin America, a push from the local organizing leaders there to move away from a more hierarchical or top-down organization to coordination. So this is the end of the talk. I don't know if I'm with time. I have some bonus. More time for questions.
Right. Well, we've got a little time for questions. So I'll start with Johan. Please rock the hand.
Thanks for talking about it. So I have a...
What's your name, sorry?
Johan. Thanks for the talk. So, suppose we agree with you, and I think it's fair that there are lots of things wrong with the world. VAT, regressive taxation, media capture, so on and so forth. I'm with you there. Where you're losing, I think, is why the language of corruption to describe all of that. So, injustice, maybe? But why is it that that's even systemic corruption? I don't quite see why we need that concept, I guess, to capture all these wrongs when we have something existing already, like, say, injustice. So I guess what is it that corruption or systemic corruption in your language adds to the analysis of these problems?
The problem with justice is that it's attached to the law, right? There is kind of of course, we talk about, systemic injustice, but when we're talking about the structural component, it's very difficult to, because we agree that there's a lot of injustice. What are you going to do about it? And part of the things that I've been talking about have little to do with justice, or with at least the way that we understand justice, like more like, through the tribunals, or something that is really against the law, or against, common sense in a way that is established. Because corruption has to do with the internal workings of the system. We think about injustice as a failure, right? Something that is not working correctly. This is at least my.
I don't think that's the prevailing definition of justice, right? So criminal justice because there's one aspect, but at least as philosophers and physical philosophy of the term, justice just means the distribution of benefits and burdens. Yes. Which can be beyond the legal system.
Yes, so, of course.
So I guess in some ways corruption is even more legalistic, I would argue, than the concept of justice.
Well, at least how it's being theorized, not only by me, but it's kind of a trend, is to separate corruption from the law. Because even like the Transparency International says, corruption as a concept, as individual corruption, doesn't make any sense transnationally. Because in some countries, some things are legal, right? And are part of the culture. So is that culture, what is the referent that we're using, right? So we can have like an equal distribution as kind of the reference, and I agree. But coming from the political side of things, I wanted to talk about the corruption of the democratic system. And that is different from justice, because justice can be in also a non-democratic place in a way. So that's why I'm bringing political corruption and systemic corruption as a political phenomenon to the system, because democracy is not only not working, it is actually created in this way. It's not a feature, it's not a bug, but a feature of the system. Maybe not convincing, but it's kind of trying to push for understanding democracy in a different way, or a democracy as a system that has decayed so much that it's really not democracy anymore. So it has mutated into another form of regime.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I work on ancient political philosophy, so let me just say your work is inspirational. Thank you for doing it. The first little thing is just, I don't think it's fair to call Plato an oligarch on the basis of the oligarchic coup. He was 21 at the time. His uncle was involved in the leadership, but I think the 21-year-olds in the room might be unhappy if we read their political views of their conservative uncle. That seems a bit of a stretch for me. So I just wanted to defend Plato on that front. But more positively, I wanted to invite you to say more about how you think the kinds of institutions that you propose can be more secure against the kind of worries that you have. So one of the things I really loved in your book was when you talked about how it was that the Roman tribunate was corrupted. So we had these wonderful democratic institutions that gave people a lot of power, and then other people with a lot of money noticed that there were these populists that had a lot of power, and then they set about corrupting them. And so I thought one of the really nice parts of your analysis was how this putatively democratic institution can so quickly become, just like another branch of the oligarchy.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to invite you to kind of speculate more and say more about how you think that the kinds of institutions that you're proposing can avoid that problem, because I really worry about that one a lot and just wanted to get more.
Yeah, me too. So first of all, of course, it's not only about the coup. I had a bonus. Not only about the coup, but also about his theory. Basically, he's against democracy. Democracy is for him an inherently corrupt regime. Like the people can never govern for the common good in a way. So that is like against the anti-majoritarian, strand in theory is pervasive, I would say. So I would say the majority of thinkers are have this kind of bias against democracy. So I wouldn't categorize him as a democratic thinker, right? So this is my take on it. In terms of the institution, so basically what we have in today is this: we have executive, judicial, and legislative, and we have kind of checking powers. And the idea of having like a popular branch that could have institutions within to basically check on the current representative government. This is what I've been trying to develop, and thank you for bringing the counterpower institutions. So the idea that we need to have not only heads. So one of the issues with the tribunate or other institutions that are being proposed is that they are standalone institutions that have no body in a way or no grounding. So you cannot have a tribunate or an institution that is elected by the people or connected to the people somehow to be able to monitor the elite if the people have no express will, if the people are not really organized on the ground. So in the ancient Rome, an example, you had the Plebeian council plus the tribunate. And even then, the tribunate was co-opted by the elite because they were granted access to the Senate, there were intermarriages. So in a way, there's always ways in which the oligarchy can control them. One of the issues there was that they were elected, right? And they were elected and they could be re-elected. They could be, they have a lot of power. So when you don't have that kind of accountability, it really is a matter of time until it becomes it's kind of phagocytated by the system. It just gets, absorbed. So we have been discussing this in Chile during the constituent process. There was a need, so for you to understand, Chile has no social rights whatsoever. Everything is private, from water to education to health, everything. So when we were drafting the new constitution, there was a lot to be done, right? A lot of socioeconomic rights that were being put into the text. And then you needed to start, if it was approved, we were thinking, well, someone needs to enforce this because there's many constitutions around the world, for example, Brazil, and that has the right to health as a constitutional right, but not really kind of like there's a lot of inequality in the enforcement. So you need an institution that is able to see the patterns of domination and be able to counteract them. So kind of an ombudsman or ombuds office, but with teeth, not a consultative as it is here, that they write reports that nobody cares about. So in a way, you would need to have an institution that is connected to the people in a strong manner. So in the Chilean example, there was a proposition from below of having a human rights ombudsman, a human rights tribunate. And the problem is who is going to be the officer, right? And the classical way of, selecting an officer is that either the president or the Congress selects, 3 people and the other picks, right? So it kind of like, it is sanctioned by the powers that are established. And this is, of course, ends up in that the person that is going to be the leader of this institution is going to be kind of a middle ground person that is not going to be really one that is going to be on top of and trying to really be militant. So they devise a way of choosing it through human rights groups. So the human rights activists would propose 3 names to Congress, and then Congress would have to select one of those. So basically, you would then guarantee that anybody that is elected to that office or appointed to that office would be actually an activist and not just a bureaucrat or a party person. So that is kind of a way that institution can be connected. They can be, as again, working groups. It could be a collective office in which, regular people can participate in a rotating manner, advised by experts, for example. So there's many ways in the selection of that institution that you could connect it to the people without elections. This would be my quick response.
Wow.
So there was.
Oh, sorry, Jeremy, I didn't see you. Should we
It's not read ahead.
The thought, just to sharpen the point just a touch.
Yeah.
One of the nice things about your insight is that power attracts money.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting about Plato's political thought is that people who are ruling are not allowed to touch money.
Yes.
And it gets around this problem because it makes them vulnerable. You put them to death if they accept money while in office. So even on the suggestion that you just gave, the concern is that you've still isolated a small group of people who can be. Now, again, I appreciate
Yes.
this is a big problem. I don't speak to solve it, but I'm just curious as to how you think about. Is this something you just consistently have to fight against?
Mm-hmm.
The power attracts money, or do you think that there's
A solution? No.
well, more drastic solutions or requirements that can be involved separately?
Yeah, so I think rotation is one of those. So I would say that the more time, because corruption needs time. You need to, if you ever have been in any kind of leadership position, you immediately become, entangled with other leader positions, other people that are in the net that you need to deal with. So if you need to interface with government or with other government officials, you will be meeting with them quite regularly, and you will be approached by people that want to influence you. So the more time you spend in that office, the worse it is, right? So we need, and the problem is that we need some kind of expertise, right? So one of the solutions of the ancient Greek democracy was this kind of working groups in which only a third of the office will rotate out, and the 2/3 will remain. So you have short, short periods of time, a year, for example, that you are, or 9 months that you are in this position. However, you come to a place that is already working, and there's people there that rotate in and out without destabilizing the office, right? So I think that is it's not a cure for this, but it makes it way more difficult. The other issue is that you need to, this institution needs to be very proliferating in a way. It cannot be a national institution. It needs to be a national institution that have regional and municipal legs. So you have even more people on the ground being a part of this kind of network kind of institution as well. So it makes it more difficult because you don't have one person making decisions. You have a lot of them making decisions. And then finally, you have the same as in ancient Greece, you have these accountability measures that you need to give account to your own community, to your own, a panel or whatever before. So you say how much you earn, how much money you have, you kind of have a full disclosure. And then at the end of your period, you get another sort of accountability in which you need to give account of what you have done. And if you have done something corrupt, you will be ineligible for any kind of office, and you would get some sanction. Of course, not prison, because that would mean that we need to go through the system, right? We need to have a way of sanctioning people or disciplining people in a political way. That it doesn't go to kind of imprisonment, because that is, again, criminal system is another story, right? So I think those are the 2 ways that we can attack the problem of money and power attracting money and basically corrupting that kind of plebeian institution. Thanks so much.
Okay, there was so much here we could talk about, the entire history of political thought and everything wrong with our world today. But I think one thing that was really quite conspicuous in its absence of right populism.
Oh.
And I think I could have given the talk you just gave. I personally wouldn't do this, but one could, and say, look, there is an elite. It's disconnected from the common people, not in material terms, because that's not what really matters, but in terms of its beliefs about sex and gender and race and nationality and immigration and religion. And it controls, the institutions of real power, which are, of course, cultural rather than material. That's why the great enemies can be called cultural Marxists or critical theorists. They're the kind of people who use the word praxis. They love Paulo Freire. And they have gained control of the most important institutions in our society, like the universities, like the schools, like the mass media, because of course that is the most important source of control over people's minds. And if you're paying attention to the billionaires rather than to the professors, then you aren't paying attention to the real elite that is really manipulating things from behind the scenes. So basically, the plebs want to kill you and me, not the people who you portray as their real enemies. And they're often committed quite genuinely to positions on a whole host of non-material issues that I'm just assuming you would find anathema, but maybe you don't. And I'm wondering why, given that the most successful actual political movements of mass mobilization that know how to use social media effectively, that know how to win elections, that know how to seize control over institutions and destroy them completely, has been using essentially the same few versus many logic that you're using. And yet they're really successful at it. And as far as I can tell, movements along the lines that you're describing have not been successful at using that same logic. Why there wasn't more discussion of really the incredible success of the kind of tactics that you're talking about?
First, well, I'm one of my areas of work is populism. Like I didn't talk about this because I feel that it's not it's too much. But so in my work I have to try to separate what is called right-wing populism from the traditional historical populism, which is based on class. So for me, what we are seeing now and in the last 15 years is a resurgence of ethno-nationalist politics, the politics of the tribe, right? The politics of the nation as an ethnic-based community, right? That wants, to keep others out, the anti-immigration. This is something that is connected to an appeal to the plebs, but an appeal that basically is not for universal or for increased welfare, but for protecting against invaders. Basically, there is a kind of a politics of fear that have been increasing in the last 15 years, especially in Europe. And in the theory area, populism, and coming from Latin America, we have more than 100 years of populist governments, populist candidates, all kinds of populists from the left, always. And the populists were understood as the leaders who were like the tribunes, who catered to the poor, basically to the working classes, and they would come to government. And some of them, because they wanted to give welfare to the people, they would not be very economically good for the system, or they would be boycotted at the point that they would not be, they would wreck the economy. So basically, populists in Latin America have the kind of the bad rep of being kind of economic wreckers, because basically they increase the welfare of the people, the wages, everything, and inflation goes, up and all these things. So it's a kind of a non-scientific kind of, or non-economic scientific kind of politics in Latin America. In the last 15 years, we have seen that there is a far-right component of the society, from political parties, especially from leadership, that has been increasing over time. And many of the theorists and political scientists have understood, conceptualized this rise of the far right as populism, which is historically incorrect and theoretically, I would say, not compatible with the way that we have traditionally understood populism from the global south. And this has two effects. One is to normalize politics of the nation, which has historically been very, very dangerous, right? That, prompts war amongst peoples. That basically normalizes some forms of exclusion that are unacceptable, basically, for liberal democracy. And on the other hand, demonizes the class-based politics. So this kind of double move comes from a lack of responsiveness from the system, because if we have democracy as the people, the majority of the people actually electing someone that will, produce results of the demands that they want, we will not be in this bind. So we have a system that has been completely unresponsive. So the people have become very precarious. The common people have become fearful of their future. They're worse than before. So the left, we're talking about the left, you will say, well, this gender ideology, we can talk more about that. I don't want to, get into, we can talk about that, but it's not the topic. Instead of offering material solutions, they have been going into, let's expand rights, formal rights, because again, this rights of recognition for the gay community doesn't bring material differences, not much in a way. And this has been very formal and very abstract and very in the cultural realm. And therefore, the conversation in the last decade has not been about, the increased welfare at all. So you have a deteriorating material conditions throughout the countries and every country. And that is kind of fertile ground for kind of an activation against, through a politics of fear. So and there's no really a radical response from the left. The left parties or the cosmopolitan parties are really very systemic pro-establishment parties. They're oligarchic. They're not really plebeian, right? So the people just want drastic measures. They just want out in a way. They just want someone who will come and change things, because we have been seeing very patiently how our material conditions keep deteriorating and everything is going and getting bleaker and bleaker. So that has allowed for this kind of politics. And I don't think, people really care much about, gender ideology or all these things. These are created narratives that are spread not only through traditional media, which are all oligarchic, by the way. So there's no plebeian media out there. Not, at least they don't own it. It's all big conglomerates. And of course, whatever they're spewing out is part of their narrative or is functional to their narrative. But now we have social media in which the far right has really come entering in those spaces and have subverted even the most basic understanding of human rights. So we have today, the more, conservative part of the Tory party even saying that they want to get out of the European Convention of Human Rights, which was written by a Tory MP. So we have gone very far away from the consensus that was built after the World War II, basically, the Second World War. There was a kind of a consensus that human rights need to be universal, that socioeconomic rights are human rights, and therefore that gender rights are also human rights, women's rights are human rights. So therefore, we need to kind of push for that. Now we have come so far that the same people that wrote those rights or were agreeing to that want to dismantle them in the kind of pushing for this narrative in this age of extreme oligarchy. So I think we need to think very critically about the different narratives that are all conducive to reinforcing the system. So if you think about Trump, he's not what pro-plebeian policy is he doing? Like nothing. It's about immigration, it's about foreign policy, but it's not about increasing the power of the people or decreasing precarity, right? There's not directly at least, right? So even if there's a narrative, there's not really a policy that goes towards that. Let's talk about Obama, for example. Obama, the first Black president of the United States, we had so much hope. This only got me almost fired at Columbia when I was teaching it, because I dare to say that Obama, as the first Black president, didn't do anything for the Black people of the United States. Not even one policy was, race-based, if you will, right? There was no really a policy directed to our empowerment of the community that he supposedly represented. He was just another neoliberal character that push for a lot of, the first one to do extrajudicial killings, and using drones to kill people abroad, and he got the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. So we have all these contradictions. And if we see these elites as just pro-oligarchic elites, we see again back to Schumpeter and the idea of this democracy being a market in a way, that politicians just cater to the market of the voters through this propaganda, and it's just about rotation of elites and kind of like choosing A or B, but nothing really is happening on the ground on a real change. We just keep, inequality keeps growing in a way. So that would be my response, that this right-wing populism, we should first call it what it is, which is another form of nationalism, or ethno-nationalism. We could call it fascism if just is against human rights or the rights of all. This is something that is also worth talking about. But the left populism, that is the ones that are more connected to the tribunate, as these leaders, imagine Tiberius Gracchus was the tribune that forced the agrarian reform in Rome, and he was stabbed to death by senators, and was the first political crime of that republic that actually prompted violence through the decades until the republic collapsed and imperial Rome was born. Right. So we have it. Nobody gives their life just by propaganda. There has to social justice. Going back to the social justice theme, is something that is is a mission. The other is I don't know. It's a difference.
Just a very quick historical footnote that we can talk about the popularis of ancient Rome and how that feeds directly into Caesar's and empire, but certainly Trump celebrates Andrew Jackson in the States in the 1830s was calling himself explicitly a populist. And that was all tied up with, yes, the banking elites of the Northeast are oppressing you by not allowing you to slaughter Native Americans and own people of color the way you would like. So it's not as if maybe the word is used differently in Latin America, but in the two great empires of Rome and the US, populism is always associated with feeding the hatreds that the mass majority feel towards certain scapegoated minorities, as well as trying to, in some respect, and certainly Trump claims he will be improving the material condition of the great majority of Americans, in part through, scapegoating various appropriate scapegoats. So this combination of playing on the hatreds of the mass for certain identifiable minorities, for certain people who deviate from a cultural consensus, was certainly part of the practice of what was explicitly called populism early in the history of the American Republic. And I think you could argue plays a role in the fascism as the fasces is an imperial Roman symbol. And in earlier centuries, it would be called Caesarism, and Caesar was, from the party of the popularis. So it's not as if
it's very complex. But let me correct the record, because the first populist party of the world, official, because there was one in Russia in the 1860s, and that basically became part of the assembly after the revolution. And it's based on agrarian communities of self-government. The first party was the People's Party in the United States. And that party, and there's difference of historiography, and we can talk more about it, but basically it was a party that was an interracial coalition of farmers and tenants in the South. And that party was very feminist. They, for example, in North Carolina, they included in they voted for, they pushed for colleges for Black people and women. Didn't exist. They were pushing for the nationalization of railway. There were the demands, and one of the demands was the free coinage of silver. And that only demand was, and it was a strategic coalition with the Democratic Party. And it's there when the hatred that you're talking about from the Democratic Party was basically connected to the Populist Party, and then the people that basically studied that phenomenon say, well, it was always, it was hatred against, Black slaves and non-white people. However, the origins actually was in Texas. The first farmers alliance that was interracial was in Texas. So we have a very complex history that has been again demonized and excluded from the record. And we have Hofstadter in the 1950s rewriting history basically and saying that the populist ideology was one of the reactionary, that they wanted to go against modernity, and they were, very against, racial integration, which was not the origin of the party. So we can think about the first years of the populist movement, or kind of the connection with the Democratic Party and then the degradation of its ideology, and kind of judge it. Where do you want to judge it? You want to judge at the end, when actually it became this hatred was turning side, right? Or at the beginning, where the movement was born out of the farmers who wanted, their production costs to go down.
I'd say it was born out of the demagogic military leadership of Andrew Jackson 50 years before that, but that's a discussion we can have.
We might move on to just take one last
Yes.
question and try and wrap up.
Or maybe we can collect it if people want to speak.
Well, at the moment we just have one last question,
Okay.
and then we can try to wrap up after.
Yeah, it was just, I guess, coming back onto the media again, mentioning this oligarchic in its conception as well, which I agree with. I do think there's a risk of seeing populism preys on the kind of the hatred of the masses. I think hatred of the masses are very much drip fed by the media. So in itself, populism is a self-perpetuating system, if you want, or right fascism, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think it's necessarily the hatred of the masses. It's more what people are telling. They're feeding that information into them anyway. But I think I agree with a lot of what you say, and I think it's a beautiful idea. Question how possible it is, and especially it seems that it would be more than just political control that you would have to revolutionize. It would be all of these multiple facets that feed into it. Like you would have to control common narrative, you'd have to control the media, you'd have to change, not control, it's the wrong word, but you'd have to change the way that everything's structured in order for it to have a chance, and if you could wave the magic wand and start it tomorrow, I believe, so many people are so disillusioned and have so much, like you said, fear and hatred that it could go horrifically wrong. You cannot trust that people would be able to sit in these groups and networks with good intentions and good beliefs, and part of it is kind of fearful on my part that at least, the system that exists, I hate it, but at least the system that is in check, for the most part of history, has wanted to veer people towards the centre, right? It's going up the opposite direction at the moment, but it has, to an extent, kept some sort of status quo. And I feel that I'm often so shocked at the way that elections go that a lot of people don't think the way that I think. I think, oh, of course. But then what's happened, how people have voted, means I don't necessarily trust.
Yeah. And I agree with you. And actually, so how this works, I saw it on the ground in Chile. So you cannot trust the people. You cannot trust us. You cannot trust it because we are neoliberal subjects. Let's start with that. We're all Amazon. We're all about consumerism. We all think about our own property. We want the good for our family, right? There's like the idea of communitary anything is not part of the game, right? So we cannot trust people that have been acculturated into a system of domination in a way. We want to be the oligarchs. At the moment that we have a little power, we want to be better and we want to oppress others. So that's why, always the better slave is captured and put into a middle management position to actually oppress his own people in a way, right? All these things happen. So one of the issues was in Chile that there were a lot of organizations already. So when the rebellion started, people started organizing like spontaneously. People that have never been in a union, nothing. They started organizing and they wanted to kind of draft articles for the new constitution. And it happened that immediately the propaganda, again, the far-right propaganda, said immediately, well, we need to utilize this new kind of organizations for our own benefit. And they started undermining human rights by catering, by saying basically to these people, you need to actually push for something that is good for you and good for your own, benefit. Don't think about human rights, don't think about these things. So one of the issues was the death penalty. So crime is a huge thing. People are insecure and people have, they immediately want to lash out against others, right? To just, revenge or whatever. this is something that is normal, and when you have been wronged. So the far right started saying, well, maybe we can bring back the death penalty because it has been abolished in Chile because it is against international law. Bring it back because in order to have a tough hand on crime. And people don't understanding that that is actually against human rights. The state having the right to kill you is something that is coming from, sovereign, medieval sovereignty in a way. Then we have moved out of that, right, in a more civilized way. So one of the things that we thought about is every assembly cannot be just, spontaneously constituted and going on. You always need basic rules of engagement, of deliberation, of respect for one another, but also basic rules of human rights respect. So you already are within a human, and democracy is another thing, like the human right legislation and all what we have achieved as a civilization in a way to not torture people, to not exclude people. This should be the base for us to work. But if we're going to not care about those rules and just kind of be willing or demanding things based on what we learn in the media, we can end up allowing for this communal spaces to be spaces of domination and to be, as you say, to kind of like reinforce the system instead of counteracting it. So we have, and we were meeting online at that moment, we were supposed COVID. So we have like a terms of engagement that when you sign up into an app, and you need to agree to the terms of conditions of the app. We had like terms of conditions that were drafted from the assembly to kind of be common to all, like the same as Luther, we would put like the letter with all the rules outside, and it would be repeated every time that the assembly met. And in that way, you can increase, have more residents going into the assembly new and knowing what are the rules, even the rules of speaking and the rules that cannot be trespassed. So if you have an initiative that goes against human rights, it would not be valid. So that's one way of counteracting. And I think it's a multi-pronged approach. You cannot just do one thing. You need to do everything. And you need to be able to put out an alternative view. And for that, you need popular media, right? And social media helps out in a way. Without that, we would have nothing.
Who's in control of the algorithm?